I know the drill.
Hey, what's up? This is Will Spur with Abysmalhymns, and I am back with Shoshana Edelberg. We had previously talked about demons and the psychology behind them and some of her work that she's doing through her school, and wanted to get a different slant on it or dig deeper into the correlation between demons and trauma. And, you know, if you listen to the last episode that we did on it, you can, you know, pull from it that there's different ways to interpret demons, whether on a actual metaphysical level or as an allegory. Um, but yeah, so let's get into it. So what are your thoughts on that concept?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me back. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite subjects. So to answer your question, there's a long history of associating demons and trauma. If you look at how the ancient world Greco-Roman Egyptian world and then the medieval world dealt with demonic encounters, it's pretty clear that they recognized that those encounters involved trauma or were traumatizing. And then, if you want to look at the literature on possession, um, that is certainly traumatizing and associated with trauma as well as with powerlessness, which can be traumatic in and of itself. So there's a long history of literature that points to this association. And there's modern psychological understandings of the association as well, speaking in terms of trauma specifically, but also in terms of things like spiritual emergency, and other sorts of experiences, psychedelic experiences that can be perhaps disruptive, or traumatic. But often, if it's not reaching the level of like a trauma that's rewiring your neurology, and that's kind of a long-term process of rewiring and healing and curing, um, at least these experiences can be very disruptive. They can be world-shaking. They can require sort of a lot of adjustment and care. And demons are associated with all of those things and have even been used sort of therapeutically by and for people who are experiencing those things.
Right. And there's a lot of instances where we've seen that. I remember in the 80s there was that big scare about satanic ritual abuse where
Yeah.
you had a lot of psychiatrists that were using hypnotism to bring out repressed memories. And I think some of those had a demonic element to them where the person manifest, symptoms, or, I mean, that's before we really got into talking about multiple personality disorder and things like disassociation, which is a common symptom of PTSD, to kind of disassociate and feel like you're the passenger in the car that is your body, just kind of, watching from the rearview mirror. But yeah, so how do you correlate those things into that?
Um, so as I've discussed with you before, I come from a background of kind of Jungian analysis and Henry Corbin, who did a lot of work on what he calls the imaginal realm, and others within kind of the transpersonal and analytical psychology frameworks. So, just so people kind of understand that I'm coming from a very specific perspective when I talk about these things. And I wanted to briefly, before I dive into it deeper, add psychosis and voice hearing to your kind of laundry list of psychological or mental suffering. And I tend to use the word suffering instead of disorder, because I don't want to necessarily pathologize what people are experiencing when they experience these things, right? So I teach a class in abnormal psychology, and I tell my students on the first day that we are renaming the class human suffering. But so disassociation, as you mentioned, definitely associated with trauma and therefore with perhaps demonic encounters, but also very much psychosis, schizophrenia, which I think schizophrenia is sort of a construct that refers to a whole lot of different things rather than a phenomena you can totally pin down. And some of these symptoms, such as voice hearing or dissociation, are not necessarily pathological either. Like perfectly healthy people, functional, not suffering people can have these experiences as well. So, it gets very murky as to like what is a disorder and what is for that person sort of a relatively normal way of experiencing the world, right? Um, so that makes it all very murky. And then, of course, you've got these issues of like, what is the demon and where is the demon? But I can tell you about some work real briefly that I think speaks to your question. This is a scholar and therapist who works in the Jungian tradition. I don't know how to pronounce his last name because I've only ever read him. I've never heard him discussed, but it's Donald Kalshed is perhaps how you pronounce the last name. But anyway, he noticed that his patients, trauma patients who had what you could consider severe trauma, though again, I'm not in the game of comparing people's traumas and ranking them according to some scale that doesn't exist of severity. But anyway, people that were really suffering, let's say. And he noticed that they were consistently dreaming of demonic figures. I mean, really consistently, dreaming of figures that they described in ways that would be considered demonic, classically demonic. And so he started working with those dreams therapeutically and having them interrogate the dream demons. What is it that you want? What is this figure saying? What does it want you to do? What is it doing in the dream? Does it feel like an ally? Does it feel like an adversary? Can you kind of change your relationship with it in your waking hours? And how does that impact the dream? Which is classical imaginal exercises as pioneered by people like Jung and James Hillman and others. So that's a classic therapeutic mode that you would do. You would tell someone to maybe work with their depression that way, name your depression, visualize it as a being. What does it look like? But he was doing that very specifically with these dream figures that he described as demons or demonic. So that's one example of sort of these demonic figures entering a person's, I don't want to say consciousness, dream consciousness, we'll say, in a way that they could then consciously work with, and that helped them work with their trauma both consciously and in the dream realm. Oh my goodness, I just lost your audio. Can you still hear me?
Yep, there we go. There's a
Okay,
lot
cool.
of layers to consciousness when it comes to sleeping and dreaming. Where people have been in, and it's common in like night terrors, for people who are they're like almost at the waking state to, see like dark figures and that type of thing. Um, like people with deliriums, and there was a thing on. It's been online for a couple of years now where, kids were taking a lot of Benadryl and seeing the Hat Man, who was like
Yeah.
a personification of the some type of symbolism as far as the Benadryl demon. And we've talked about in the past too with psychedelics that they're distinct entities associated with each drug, where it's like machine elves with DMT or more like serpentine things with mushrooms and other psychedelics. So yeah, so that's also dependent, I would suppose, on it is the what state of consciousness are you in? And my thought, if we're thinking of it as science, would be the vibratory frequencies. What vibration does that state of consciousness have to either trigger that part of the brain or, if we're getting into a little more, quantum physics, well, maybe there are certain things on certain layers of consciousness that are really certain layers of reality. So those things aren't necessarily not real. Um, because I have a hard time reconciling the fact that so many people are seeing something that would be, just something that is being created in their head, which has been a similar argument people have used for like Bigfoot. Well, if Bigfoot's not real, then where are all these people seeing it? And I mean, aliens, the same thing. Which maybe it's all, I mean, it's like you were saying, man and his symbols. So, what are these archetypes and symbols that are so powerful and ingrained in us? It's like which came first, the collective consciousness to come up with this, or something that sparked the collective consciousness to process it, if that makes sense.
Well, it does. But I want to interrogate this idea of real for a minute because it's obviously critical. And, definitely there's a lot you can say on that drawing from quantum mechanics, quantum physics. But so I have an idea in my work that from this perspective, there's a difference between like a place and a realm and a location. A location is in physical reality. It's your address. It's where, I might send you a Christmas card. That's your location. It's the thing we sometimes put in Facebook, um, to tag a post with. But a place or a realm um, can be somewhere that I would call liminal. These are spaces in between spaces. Like a dream is a liminal space of consciousness. A visionary state is a liminal state of consciousness. And people sort of dismiss that as, oh, that's your imagination. But why do we claim that the imagination is not real, quote unquote, when the experience of the imagination, or what Corbin would have called the imaginal, and his followers, including me, sort of referred to when we're referring to a place where these things are, it's in the quote unquote imaginal realm. Again, implying that this is a place. It may be a liminal place that's in between, you know, other places. It's not maybe a material, physical sort of, I'm knocking on my desk. So it's not, sort of a physical place that you can walk on necessarily or locate yourself in. Mail me a letter if mailing was a thing in this imaginal realm. But the experience of it is very real and very common. It's not uncommon for people to experience these liminal places at all. They just dismiss it. I mean, you mentioned sleep paralysis and the dark figure or demonic figure at the end of the bed. Like, how is the experience not real? Or at least very much psychologically or spiritually real. We have what's called scientism in our culture, which is sort of the worship of the scientific rather than being informed by the scientific, but almost the worship of it as though it's a secular god or a humanistic god. Like you even hear people say, well, I believe in science, which is a very silly thing to say because science is not an entity that, of course, that you can believe in or disbelieve in. It's a process of inquiry. But anyway, so is it real? It's real, and we said this before to those who are experiencing it. And is there a place, not a location, but a place where you're having these entity encounters? And to me, and in my work, I sort of start with the foundation that yes, we can talk about places and we can talk about realms and we can even talk about portals, particularly with trauma, because what does trauma do? Trauma creates a psychic wound, which a wound is an opening, right? A wound has ripped open something that was whole before. So, does that constitute a portal from a place to another place? I can't answer these things definitively, but in my work, I certainly explore the possibility of place and realm and portal to and from imaginal realms where you would encounter entities, including and often predominantly, depending on what's going on with you, demons.
Right. And it's kind of funny because like I have been, I think I said to you before off camera that, I've been doing a lot of research or, TISM searching about demons, but it's, the only thing you can find it on are like these Christian YouTube channels, which is fine. It seems a little odd that they're the only people that are willing to talk about it, but okay, I can deal with that. If McDonald's is the only place to get a fried pie, that's where I'll go. But they have brought up the concept too that it's kind of like, the wound theory. So it by having that opening, by having that wound, well, that makes you more susceptible for, and I get they don't put it this way, but the way I'm putting it is, for bacteria to enter the body. Uh,
Sure.
so that would make you more, unless you keep it sterile and that type of stuff, it can cause infection. So there's that. So I think that that is, and to me, that seems pretty viable on, I guess whatever levels and layers there are to it. I also like the you were talking about the liminal spaces, and it made me think of I have this reoccurring dream where I'm at my grandparents' house and I go upstairs to the second floor, and where there was one of those like attic door things that you push open, it's all like the pink fluffy stuff with asbestos and that type of thing. Instead of that, there's this red room where everything is upside down. And I always
Mm.
go into it and I'm like, okay, well, this is a little creepy. But then there's a stairway that goes down from that room and I always stop halfway down the stairway. It's like a sense of what you can't go down there. And
Yes.
so I think that that could be the compartmentalization of the psyche that we get from trauma, because a lot of times, particularly I think if it's, and I don't know the statistics on this, but I think that younger people, children, when they experience trauma, their brains aren't as mature to process it, so it tends to fragment off and, splinter off. And that's why, I know in the 70s we had like there were all those books about trauma and multiple personality disorder was like when the rabbit howls and those books, which kind of, you know, I remember them being on a similar shelf to The Exorcist in the bookstores, but they were, biographic. So yeah, so I think it's kind of like, space travel or any other science, the deeper that we start researching things, the easier it is to, or at least for me, it's more interesting to put these pieces together.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a good analysis of it. But that's also why, like in shamanic literature, there's this phenomenon of soul calling, because you talked about the fragmenting. And so in some shamanic cultures, there's the belief that the pieces of the soul that carry the trauma actually go somewhere else because it's just too painful for the traumatized person to carry those memories that those soul pieces contain. And so in shamanic healing, they'll call those fragmented pieces back from the place that they have gone to hide in order to help, the person. And sometimes techniques like that can be re-triggering and re-traumatizing. So I have to give my usual disclaimer that I give when I talk to you, to people that are watching. Please don't do these intense techniques on yourself without some kind of therapist or counselor or priest or, whatever it is that you go to, wherever you go for support, if you are not grounded and stable. Because there is always the possibility that these things are going to be re-triggering or re-traumatizing and you're going to need help processing them. So that's something I always feel that I need to say because people are like, I'm going to do shadow work. And you're completely not grounded and not stable, and you're going to do something that's going to shake you up um, in a way that you might need help processing. The other thing that I wanted to bring up based on what you said, is the issue of personality. So definitely certain personality traits, traumatized or not, can make a person more susceptible to these sorts of experiences. And there's one phenomenon that's being studied a lot by transpersonal psychologists and parapsychologists that's called transliminality, which basically can translate to an easier ability to sort of go into altered states and liminal places. And people that score high on transliminality tend to have more of those sorts of experiences, including demonic encounters. Now, can you argue that trauma can cause transliminality? Sure, you can make that argument, I think, but that's not always the case either. Some people are just sort of naturally that way. And then there's also neurological theories of filtering that some brains have higher levels of filtering so that these experiences are less likely to occur because the person's just very strongly filtered, and trauma can certainly cause filtering, but I think it's usually imperfect filtering because that stuff kind of creeps in no matter how much you're kind of um, filtering it out, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah, and I kind of see in some of that in the, I guess what you call transluminality. The first off, one point, the first light bulb that went off in my head was, is this something that you can like stretch for like yoga to be more flexible? And is that something that increases when people do psychedelics would be one thought. Another thought would be the tendency to want to solve your problems with those drugs, people would be more inclined to do that if they were already that leaning as being transluminals, and then where, that kind of ends and like mental health begins. Because I remember talking to my therapist decades ago, and she was saying that how, things like LSD can affect people that are have a genetic history of like schizophrenia differently than a normal person. So where does that type of genetic predisposition begin and the transluminal personality, begin?
Yeah, those are really good questions. Are you familiar with the idea of epigenetics? Right. So epigenetics might hold some answers in terms of how a genetic propensity reifies itself given certain environmental pressures. And yes, I mean, I think you can ask all those questions about transliminality. But to me, to kind of answer your first question, I believe that all these sorts of phenomena that get called psi phenomenon in parapsychology circles, things like PK, things like telepathy, all of that are kind of human experiences that, again, are not necessarily uncommon. And I do think that exercising that muscle if you will. And if you're interested, through things like meditation, through things like vision work, through things like repetitive prayer, even walking prayer, whatever it is that kind of gets you into that flow state, you can cultivate these things. But definitely people that are already inclined to transliminality are probably going to have an easier time than people that are hard skeptics or filtered or face the potential of being re-triggered or re-traumatized by such an experience. And that's, of course, why psychedelic therapy is so promising, given correct dosages and correct guidance and correct circumstances and all of that. Like people who sort of try to do that on their own really can end up stumbling into unhelpful experiences. But definitely under proper circumstances, that's why it's so effective, because it makes it easier for you to experience transliminality. It helps erode those filters or make them more flexible. I mean, yeah, some people are just naturally more filtered than others, but I believe that everyone has the capacity for these sorts of what they call anomalous experiences, though to me it's not that anomalous because it's just all throughout history. And the study that I've discussed with you before that I'm working on now, we've had skeptics go into the Gansfeld state and have transliminal experiences and hit the telepathy target. And so there's also the work on the telepathy tapes, which is controversial, but I've met one of the main psychologists working on it, talking about how autistic people, um, nonverbal autistic people in particular, are less filtered and so have these experiences of telepathy. So mix all of that in with trauma, and then you have a long conversation about the neurology of trauma, and the best ways to heal it and the medicalization of approaches to trauma, which, if you're on certain drugs, you're not going to have transliminal experiences. Mm. So I've lost your audio again. Let's hope it snaps back.
Yeah, I was
There we go.
here, I'm back now.
Yay.
I slipped into a liminal state. I was thinking about how I was way ahead of my time when I was 22 and was dropping acid and playing with Ouija boards at the same time. And that, but it kind of brings you back to, well, what is the need? Like people have a need to do those things even if they don't have the intentionality behind it.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so I
Absolutely.
think it's no mistake that people dabble in that type of stuff because it's kind of like folk medicine. We're trying to get to a place because there was a need, they just didn't know the methods to fill the need.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why people are driven to self-medicate, in all kinds of ways. You have, people with, say, bipolar sort of issues who are leveling themselves out with alcohol. It's not a good idea. It's not a long-term fix, but people are certainly kind of intuitively led to experiences that are going to help them balance their imbalances a lot of times because they're shut out of the so-called healthcare system, including the mental health care system, or insurance is not going to pay for somebody to interrogate the demons in their dreams, right? And
Right.
so, there's a lot of people out there who are floundering around reading and experiencing and trying to get, to their trauma on their own because they have no choice.
Right, for sure. And I think that, it is my experience too, is that there are, if you, you know, go at it hard enough, there are some tools out there. So if you're listening to this and think that there's no way to get help, well, there are programs. You just have to certainly do some looking.
Absolutely.
Right. And I think that going back to the demon thing before we get zoomed out of control is it's the understanding, like the levels of understanding the problem, whether it's these things opening a portal or not, there's a reason for the symbolism. That's kind of,
Absolutely.
and I think
Absolutely.
that is the symbolism is definitely real, and how we relate to that on a mental, physical, spiritual level, there's something behind it because if that's not the case, then why has it been happening for since we could draw on walls of caves?
And across cultures.
Right,
I
and across
mean,
cultures, which is just like Bigfoot. I was I might have brought this up before, but it was Jane Goodall that was talking about to one of these scientists that I saw at a Bigfoot convention who told she worked with Jane Goodall, and Jane Goodall said, in every place that I've been researching apes, I always ask if they've seen a 7 foot tall ape walking around, and she was in like Borneo or Uganda, and some hunters passed this question along, and one guy came back and was like, "Oh yeah, we see that all the time. It's over there." So yeah, so there's something to it. It's just a big world. So if it's the even bigger world in the interworld of our minds. So, you know, who knows what's there.
which is real. And,
Yes, which is
that'll be the
real.
last point that, I want to double down on before we get de-zoomed is your experience is a real experience.
Right. And I think that things like media portrayals. I think if you think about it, like media portrayals of mental health and media portrayals of demons give it the what I call the ancient aliens treatment. It makes it look because the host of Ancient Aliens is a guy with crazy hair, that Sukaloff dude. If they put somebody on there that looked, like Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking reasonably about it and was not like, dude, it's probably demons or it's probably aliens or it's probably whatever, then I think that they automatically set that up to be made entertainment. Just like if you think about, I very rarely see any movies that portray bipolar or schizophrenia or anything other than like a one flew over the cuckoo's nest, we're gonna go crazy in the day room type situation. Just like demons, everybody's like doing these limbos that are dislocating their shoulders and climbing up the walls. It's like, well, what about, I mean, sure, an accurate portrayal might not be as popcorn consuming.
No, but
So,
it does a lot of harm to people who are struggling with those kinds of diagnoses. To see that portrayed that way in YouTube videos or movies or whatever it is, it really causes a stigma and causes people to not seek help when help is available.
right, totally. And I think that, it's like one thing I always say is that, 12-step programs are sanctioned by the government. So when people get DUIs, they have to go get their sheets signed. And that's something that the justice system has signed on for as being an okay treatment. So if seeking that type of spiritual help has been okayed by the government, then why not other forms?
Well, I would strongly agree with you, but for your listeners, or viewers, there are people like me out there as therapists and coaches and spiritual directors who have sliding scales. Particularly in larger cities, it is possible to find a person who's going to take your experiences seriously and help you make meaning out of them.
Right. So yeah, so there's that. So there is meaning out there. If you search for it, the end of the day, we're saying it's all real, and you can look into it further with a professional. Just don't drop some acid and play with a Ouija board. That would be
No,
my
ill-advised.
suggestion of what not to do, unless you
Exactly.
like vomiting milk at the door of a convenience store. I would not suggest it.
Do not try it at
Do not try that.
home.
That was my evil Knievel. All right. Well, thanks so much for being on. And, this is a broad topic with a lot of depth to it. So we'll have to return to it at some point in time and find the connections too between some of the psychic research because I think that there are connectivity in a lot of places. So thank you guys. Thank you for being here and see you soon.